from isolation to integration, to emphasize focused segmental mobilization of the thoracic vertebrae. Mobilization exercise directed to mobilize the thoracic vertebrae, T1 through 12, in the sagittal plane is a very important component, mainly in the treatment of structural kyphosis, which is characterized by rigidity and functional inflexibility of the thoracic vertebrae. Note, mobilization in this context refers to segmental movement of the vertebrae and not to stretching or strengthening muscles. Prolonged thoracic flexion, months or years. Let's look at the anterior longitudinal ligament mobilization exercise directed to mobilize the anterior longitudinal ligament is a very important component. In order to mobilize the vertebrae, in the first stage, it is important to isolate movement in the thoracic area from the lumbar area and gradually to integrate this area with the other areas of the body. The movement potential of the thoracic vertebrae, especially in structural deformations, is relatively small and ranges of movement are limited, mainly in the sagittal plane. Structural deformation, small mobility potential. Therefore, the tendency is to take the movement to another place above and below the thoracic vertebrae, the lumbar and cervical vertebrae. This is called compensation. The way that a movement limitation in the thoracic area creates a tendency to excessive movement in neighboring areas. Inflexibility of the thoracic vertebrae. Here we can see an example of a characteristic chain reaction in kyphosis. As a result of difficulty in performing segmental straightening of the thoracic vertebrae, most of the movement is transferred to the lower back vertebrae, global extension instead of local extension in the thorax. Another example, when performing extension, arching movements. Rigidity in the thoracic vertebrae creates chain reactions that transfer most of the movement to the lumbar vertebrae. Here we can see a compensation, excessive mobility in the lower back. How do we isolate the thoracic area? To isolate the thoracic area, we need to stabilize the lumbar area and thus prevent extension in this area. How can we stabilize the lumbar area and prevent extension there? We must adjust the starting positions of the various exercises to obtain focused, localized movement. Place greater emphasis on starting positions that will stabilize the lumbar area and thus help to isolate the thoracic vertebrae more effectively. How can we know which starting positions are most suitable for stabilizing the lumbar area? In choosing the starting positions, attention to the kinesiological connections between the positions of the hip, pelvis, and lower back vertebrae. The functional connection between hip position and pelvic position has a direct effect on the lumbar vertebrae as well. 1. Hip flexion. 2. Posterior pelvic tilt. 3. Flattening of the lordosis. Thus, any change in hip joint position affects pelvic position and, through this, the lumbar curve. Hip flexion of up to about 90 degrees can be performed without pelvic involvement. Hip flexion above 90 degrees begins to create posterior PC tilt and, as a result, reduce lumbar lordosis. As a range of hip flexion increases, Posterior pelvic tilt will also begin to increase and further reduce lumbar lordosis. Posterior pelvic tilt reduces lumbar lordosis, stabilizes the area, and does not allow extension in these vertebrae. In treating kyphosis, we want this in order to isolate the movement of the thoracic vertebrae from the lumbar vertebrae. Examples of starting positions that emphasize localized mobility of the thoracic vertebrae. What is common to all the starting positions is a position that entails hip flexion of more than 90 degrees in order to limit anterior pelvic tilt and to prevent the transfer of movement to the lumbar vertebrae. From this condition of isolation of the thoracic vertebrae, we will gradually integrate this area with other areas of the body. The details of therapeutic exercises that make use of this principle